I had just made myself a cup of coffee when the email arrived. Subject line: termination of employment, effective immediately. At first, I thought it was spam or a mistake. I had just been named Employee of the Month, for God's sake. I'd worked late every night the past quarter, identified a cost-saving measure that added $300,000, 0 cents to the bottom line, and received a personal thank you from the VP of Finance 2 days ago. I opened the email. No mistake. It was real. No warning, no meeting, no explanation. Just a cold paragraph from HR informing me that my role had been phased out due to restructuring. I read it 3 times before it sank in. I was fired. And not just fired. I was erased. My badge access was cut off within the hour. My internal accounts were deactivated. The Slack channels I'd lived in for the last 4 years vanished. No goodbye. No exit interview. No handshake. Just digital silence. I stood frozen in my apartment, the coffee in my hand going cold. My name is Rachel Miller. I'm 31 years old, a senior financial analyst at Branix Health Systems, or at least I was until 9:47 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. I wasn't just good at my job, I was exceptional. Numbers don't lie, but apparently they do scare people, especially when those numbers start pointing toward fraud. It started 2 weeks ago, completely by accident. I was reviewing vendor invoices for Q3 reconciliation. One line item caught my attention. $1,112,000, 0 cents paid to a marketing subcontractor I'd never heard of, Silver Wave Strategies. That alone wasn't suspicious. We outsourced all kinds of things. But the payment descriptions were vague: brand analysis, Q market funnel, and no reports were attached. I dug a little. No entries in our marketing systems, no references in campaign meetings. I checked previous quarters. Silverwave had billed us over $1,800,000, 0 cents in less than 10 months. No oversight, no deliverables, just payments, like clockwork. I flagged it to my supervisor, Laura. She looked uncomfortable and told me to focus on the vendors you were assigned. That's when the pit in my stomach began, so I dug deeper. I pulled bank records from our internal financial portal and started matching payment dates to approval chains. Every Silverwave payment had been approved by one person, our CEO, Stephen Klein. Normally, the CEO never signs off on vendor payments. That's what the finance division and procurement teams are for. This was different. And when I tried to access Silverwave's corporate registry, it redirected to a P.O. box in Nevada, a shell company. I wasn't an auditor, I wasn't compliance, but I knew what money laundering looked like in spreadsheets. I printed my findings and asked for a meeting with our internal risk officer. That meeting never happened. The next day, my laptop was taken for a routine security sweep. I was locked out of our financial software. Then HR called me for a performance check-in I'd never been scheduled for. They asked leading questions about my recent behavior, if I felt stressed, if I'd been taking time off, if I was feeling emotionally supported. It was surreal. I wasn't being evaluated. I was being profiled, branded as a problem. I kept quiet. I thought, maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe if I gave them time, the right people would step in. I still believed someone would care. Instead, the next morning, I was told my position had been eliminated. No severance, no references, just silence. I sat on my couch for hours after that, my folder of printed invoices beside me unopened. I wanted to cry, to scream, to call someone, but no one answered. My friends at work stopped replying. My LinkedIn started showing connections moving on without mentioning what had happened to me. I wasn't laid off, I'd been erased. But I wasn't done. I hadn't come this far in my career by backing down. If they thought firing me would make this disappear, they had no idea who they were dealing with. I didn't want revenge. I wanted justice for the company, for the people whose retirement funds were tied up in our stock, for every employee who trusted leadership to be accountable. I knew exactly what I had to do next. They tried to shut me up, and now I was going to make sure the whole world heard. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every meeting, every interaction, every glance that now felt like foreshadowing. It all made sense in hindsight. The way Laura avoided eye contact the day I showed her the Silverwave payments, the tightness in her voice when she told me to drop it, the sudden shift in attitude from HR, who had always treated me like a model employee. They weren't reacting to a performance issue, they were executing a cover-up, and I had become a liability. But they made one mistake. They underestimated how much I remembered. I'd always been obsessive about documentation, an occupational hazard in finance. My personal laptop still held exported spreadsheets, email screenshots, and notes I'd compiled while reviewing vendor transactions. I hadn't meant to collect them as evidence. I kept them because I never trusted our internal systems to retain files the way I needed them. That instinct was about to become my greatest asset. I pulled up my external drive and started cataloging everything I had. Payment records, approval logs, emails, and system screenshots that showed how Silverwave wasn't listed in our active marketing contracts. More damningly, I had 3 separate occasions where payments to Silverwave were listed as internal dev services on financial summaries, descriptions that would never raise a red flag in a cursory audit. With deliberate mislabeling. The deeper I went, the angrier I became. This wasn't sloppy accounting, it was calculated fraud. Someone had created a shell company, funneled company money through it, and covered the trail with fake labels and executive overrides. And every time I asked a question, I was pushed out a little more. Fired for asking why. $1,800,000. 0 cents vanished into a black hole. Fired for doing my job too well. But what infuriated me most wasn't the theft. It was the arrogance, the belief that I'd go quietly, that I'd just rebuild my life and move on, pretending none of this ever happened. They thought I had no power. That was about to change. The next morning, I tried something bold. I showed up at Brannick's headquarters. Not to reclaim my job. I knew that door was shut. I needed one more thing. One piece of physical evidence I hadn't managed to back up. A hard copy of the internal compliance memo that originally approved Silverwave as a vendor. I knew where it was kept. I had handled the files myself. Normally, you need badge access to get into the document archive room, but I knew the building's layout, the shift patterns of the security team, and most importantly, I had a friend on the inside. Tanya was in procurement. We weren't close, but we'd always had mutual respect. She was the kind of person who spoke in facts, not gossip. I called her from a coffee shop down the block. When she picked up, her voice was quiet, cautious. "Rachel, are you okay?" I didn't answer directly. I just said, "I need 15 minutes. I need to retrieve something. After that, you'll never hear from me again." She didn't ask questions. She told me when to come in during the post-lunch lull when most of the team would be in meetings or on break. That's how I found myself walking through the side employee entrance of Brannick's Health Systems in a plain black coat and a borrowed visitor badge. I moved quickly, head down, pretending to be a courier. The file room was exactly where I remembered. 3rd floor, back hallway, behind the HR wing. I slipped inside unnoticed. The file I needed was labeled under Vendor Onboarding Q4 FY22. When I found the folder, my hands were shaking. Inside was the original form signed by Stephen Klein himself. The approval was routed directly through the executive office, bypassing the standard procurement review. That was unusual. What was worse? Attached to the file was a non-disclosure agreement, forcing internal approvers to keep vendor details classified due to competitive sensitivity. No one had ever mentioned that to me before. I took photos of every page on my phone, double-checked the archive logs to make sure nothing was out of place, and left the room exactly as I found it. On my way out, I passed a group of executives heading into the elevator. One of them looked familiar. Ben Childress, VP of Investor Relations. He locked eyes with me for a split second, confusion registering before recognition. I kept walking. Tanya texted me later. "Ben saw you, be careful." I knew I was on borrowed time. That night, I went through every document, every photo, building a single digital folder labeled Whistleblower Full Dossier. I knew what I had was big, I just didn't know if it was big enough to take down a CEO. I started looking up legal resources, whistleblower laws, protections, government reporting protocols. Everything led to one agency, the FBI. They had a tip line for corporate fraud and embezzlement. It wasn't a joke. They handled this kind of thing all the time, especially in the healthcare sector. I called. I didn't give my name. I just described the scope of what I had. The woman on the other end asked pointed questions. Do you have documentation, internal emails, evidence of intent? I told her yes. She transferred me. The next voice I heard belonged to Special Agent Kyle Denton, White Collar Crimes Division. We talked for almost 40 minutes. He asked about my role, the timeline of events, the structure of the fraudulent payments, and the company's internal handling. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then he said, "We'd like to meet, in person." I drove to the local field office the next day, wearing the same coat I'd used to sneak into my old building. Agent Denton greeted me with a folder and a legal pad. His questions were clinical, calm. He didn't react much, but I could tell he was processing everything quickly. At one point he asked, "You realize if what you're saying is true, this could be prosecuted as federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and securities fraud, right?" I nodded. "And you're willing to testify?" "If I have to," I said, though inside I was shaking. He closed his notepad. "Then we'll be in touch. This doesn't go away quietly." I walked out of that building with trembling legs and fire in my chest. I had done it. I had taken the first real step. And I knew now, without a doubt, that this wasn't just a personal fight anymore. It was a legal one, a criminal one. And they wouldn't be able to erase that with a performance review or a PR statement. They fired me to bury a scandal. But I had just handed it to the one agency they couldn't control. The game had changed, and I wasn't playing defense anymore. The days following my meeting with Agent Denton moved slowly, like wading through wet cement. Every hour that passed without a call or email from the FBI felt like a countdown to nothing. I checked my phone obsessively, half expecting some cease and desist letter from Brannix to arrive before the law had a chance to intervene. But the silence stretched on. I tried to keep busy, tried to breathe, but the uncertainty was suffocating. What if they dismissed the case? What if I didn't have enough? What if this ended with me blacklisted, broke, and humiliated while the people who ruined my life kept cashing their bonuses? One evening, while scrolling aimlessly through job listings I didn't care about, my phone buzzed. It was an unlisted number. I almost ignored it, until I remembered that Denton said someone from the team might reach out. I answered, and a calm male voice introduced himself as Agent Liam Crenshaw, a forensic accountant working on Denton's task force. He asked if I could meet him the next day to go over the technical elements of the payments I reported. It wasn't an interrogation, it was interest. That night I organized everything. Again, I printed timelines, color-coded payment flows, annotated every suspicious transaction. I wanted to be ready. I needed to be useful. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about making sure they didn't get away with it. The meeting with Agent Crenshaw was different than my first. It was longer, deeper. He asked about the software Brannix used, the approval hierarchies, access credentials, who had override privileges, who could create vendors, who controlled naming conventions on accounting line items. He wasn't just fact-finding, he was building a case. I could tell. At one point, he asked me to walk him through how I originally noticed the discrepancies. I told him it started with one invoice, then ballooned. He nodded. That's usually how it works. They get greedy. He stayed silent for a moment, flipping through my notes. "Rachel, has anyone contacted you from the company since you were terminated?" I shook my head. "Not a word." He made a small note. "Good. If that changes, tell us immediately. And don't engage. Let us handle it." It was the first time I truly realized I had backup, that this wasn't just me fighting a system that didn't care. The federal government was now watching Brannix, and I had lit the fuse. A week later, something happened that caught me completely off guard. I got a message request on LinkedIn from someone named Paul Ellis, no profile photo, barely any info, but the message was just 3 words, "I believe you." I hesitated, then replied cautiously, "Do I know you?" What followed was a story eerily similar to mine. Paul had been a mid-level auditor at Brannix for 3 years. Last year, he was let go suddenly after flagging payment inconsistency involving another vendor, one that, it turned out, also shared a P.O. box address in Nevada. He never connected the dots until he heard rumors that a new whistleblower had come forward. Me. We arranged a call. He was hesitant at first, but after some time he opened up. He had been silenced. humiliated and blackballed just like I was. But he had saved a few things, documents, notes. He offered to share them. I gave him a secure drop link provided by the FBI. He uploaded everything that night. The following week, Crenshaw called again. His tone had changed. It was sharper. "We've verified multiple layers of the fraud, Rachel. Your data checks out. Ellis's too. This isn't just a side scam, it's systemic, and it goes back further than we thought." I asked what that meant. He paused. "It means it's bigger than Klein. We think others in senior leadership knew, maybe even helped cover it up. We're expanding the scope. But we'll need your help again." I agreed without hesitation. My role shifted from whistleblower to de facto consultant. I wasn't just telling my story anymore, I was helping build theirs. Every time I answered an email from Crenshaw or Denton, I felt a little more in control, a little less erased. But with every step forward, the risk increased. I started noticing things. A black SUV parked outside my apartment 2 days in a row. A strange man standing by the lobby doors who vanished when I looked twice. Then a package arrived. No return address. Just a manila envelope with my name written in block letters. Inside, a single printed email chain between me and Lara from a year ago. Nothing dangerous, but the message was clear. We're watching. I forwarded everything to Denton, who told me to relocate temporarily. I packed a bag and moved in with my cousin 3 towns over. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't argue. If Brannick's thought intimidation would stop me, they didn't understand what they'd created. They didn't understand what they'd broken inside me, and what had grown in its place. During this time, Crenshaw shared a bombshell. Silverwave Strategies was traced back to a holding company managed by someone named Julia St. James. A name that, on paper, seemed like a random business manager. But a few layers down, it turned out Julia was a domestic partner of Stephen Klein. They had a vacation home together in Aspen, registered under the holding company's name. More than that, she had been on the payroll of 4 separate Brannick's vendors over the past 5 years. All shells. All fake, all funneling money. Denton's team was building the timeline, and I was helping connect the dots from the inside. I explained how Klein had full override privileges, how only his signature appeared on final stage vendor approvals, how the finance team was siloed to prevent cross-verification. "It's a control scheme," I told them. "He built it so no one person could see the full picture." But I did. I was never supposed to. Crenshaw just said, "You're not the only one anymore." By the end of that month, they had enough to request a federal warrant for a data seizure. They raided Brannick's internal servers at 2 a.m. on a Saturday, taking drives, backups, encrypted emails, cloud archives. It was quiet. Surgical, the company released a vague statement about routine compliance auditing the following Monday. But I knew the clock had started ticking on Stephen Klein's kingdom. The last time I spoke to Crenshaw that month, he told me something that stuck with me. "Most people think whistleblowers want revenge," he said. "But really, most of them just want someone to care." "You were right, Rachel. Now let's prove it." I hung up and stared at my laptop, at the folder I'd labeled months ago in anger and desperation. It no longer felt like a cry for help. It felt like the beginning of justice. By the time the raid on Brannick servers made its quiet sweep through their data centers, I had already crossed a threshold. I wasn't just trying to survive anymore, I was invested in bringing the entire rot to the surface. I knew now that what had happened to me was just one layer of something much bigger. Stephen Klein hadn't simply diverted company funds into a shell corporation for personal gain. He had built a pipeline, one that had existed for years, protected by silence, NDAs, and fear. What started as one red-flagged invoice had turned into a network of fake vendors, shadow accounts, and diverted funds that totaled well over $5 million, 0 cents. I wasn't the first to notice. I was just the first one who didn't back down. The FBI moved methodically. After the data seizure, they began conducting off-record interviews with current and former employees. Some talked, most didn't. Fear still ran deep inside Brannick's, and with good reason. The company had built a reputation for brutal litigation, even against its own. I learned through Agent Denton that at least 3 people had been silenced with settlements and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. But one thing changed the momentum. A break in the firewall logs from the server raid revealed an encrypted email archive belonging to Stephen Klein's executive assistant. It was a digital goldmine. Inside the archive were hundreds of messages, many of them buried in code speak and vague language, but the pattern was undeniable. References to preferred routes, optimized returns, and maintenance cycles matched perfectly with the timing of payments to shell vendors. Even more damning were the approval messages. Klein directly instructing finance staff to process urgent invoices without full documentation, citing board directives that never existed. But what sealed it wasn't just the paper trail. It was the personal messages between Klein and Julia St. James. The emails were encrypted, but the FBI cracked them in under a day. They revealed trips to Aspen, Paris, and Tulum, all funded through company money disguised as operational expenses. They joked about beating the audits again, and how the company was basically our private ATM. They were arrogant, sloppy, and, most importantly, traceable. Crenshaw called me the night they cracked the archive. His voice was different. We've got him. We're drafting the indictments now, but we need one more thing from you. I was stunned. What else could I possibly give you? A voice. He explained that they wanted me to testify before a grand jury to validate the documents and help contextualize the company's internal systems. My testimony could bridge the gap between technical evidence and corporate practice. They didn't just need a whistleblower, they needed a narrator. Someone who could walk 12 ordinary citizens through how one man built a machine of fraud so complex that it looked like business as usual. I agreed, but my nerves were shot. I'd never testified in court, let alone in front of a grand jury deciding the fate of a man with millions at his disposal. The days leading up to my appearance were a blur of preparation. I worked with federal attorneys who coached me on how to answer without speculating, how to stick to the facts, how to stay calm if pressed. I wasn't scared of telling the truth, but I was terrified of being torn apart by lawyers whose only job was to make me look unhinged or vindictive. But when I walked into that courtroom, sat in front of the 12 jurors and saw their faces, some curious, some skeptical, I felt something shift. I wasn't just the woman who got fired anymore. I was the person who knew what had really been happening while the rest of the company looked the other way. I started from the beginning. I told them about the invoice, about Silverwave, about the fake descriptions, the approvals from Klein, the intimidation from HR, the isolation. I showed them how a simple vendor payment bypassed 3 layers of review because one man had executive override authority. I explained how compliance was systematically neutered and how whistleblowers were quietly erased before their voices could carry. I answered questions about policy, access controls, vendor approval processes, and the internal culture of Brannix. I didn't embellish, I didn't dramatize, I gave them the unvarnished truth. When I finished, there was a pause. One juror leaned forward and asked, "Why didn't anyone else come forward?" I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Because the last 3 people who tried were silenced, discredited, and forced into NDA settlements. I just had nothing left to lose." That moment stuck. I could feel it. The weight of my words shifted the room. A week later, I got the call. The grand jury had returned multiple indictments against Stephen Klein, Julia St. James, and 2 senior executives at Brannix. Charges included wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to defraud shareholders. I thought I'd feel triumph, but what I felt instead was a strange calm. It wasn't over, but we'd cracked the dam, and water was rushing through the cracks. The media caught wind fast. Brannix tried to control the narrative, issued a statement claiming surprise and disappointment over recent allegations, but no amount of PR spin could hide what was coming. The Department of Justice confirmed the investigation. News outlets dug up board minutes, stock movements, past lawsuits. Suddenly, Brannix wasn't a model healthcare company anymore. It was a sinking ship with a criminal at the helm. In retaliation, Brannix's legal team tried to smear me. Anonymous leaks claimed I had been unstable, that I'd falsified records, that I had an obsessive vendetta. But by then, the evidence was public, and the agents backing me had zero tolerance for retaliation. Crenshaw warned their counsel once, then they filed a cease and desist. After that, the smears stopped. Stephen Klein was arrested 2 weeks later at his home in the Hamptons. The footage showed him in a bathrobe, stunned, as federal agents walked him to the car in handcuffs. Julia was picked up the same morning at a private spa in Arizona. Brannix's stock tanked. The board dissolved its executive team. Lawsuits from shareholders began pouring in, and through it all, I watched quietly from my cousin's living room, sipping coffee that finally stayed warm long enough to enjoy. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, it was release. For months, I had carried the weight of a secret so ugly that it nearly destroyed me. Now it was out, and nothing they could do would ever bury it again. They had fired me to protect a lie. But the truth didn't need a corner office or a corporate title. It just needed a voice, and mine had finally been heard. The first court appearance was surreal. Stephen Klein walked into the federal courtroom in a tailored suit, flanked by 2 attorneys who looked like they'd been pulled from the pages of a corporate legal thriller. He didn't glance my way, but I saw in his posture, tight, rehearsed control, the confidence of a man who still believed he could charm his way out of anything. I wasn't required to attend, but I did. I wanted to see the moment reality caught up to him, the press huddled outside, capturing every second. Klein's PR team had tried to spin his arrest as a coordinated misunderstanding, a phrase that vanished the moment the prosecution listed the charges aloud in open court: 11 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of embezzlement, conspiracy, and obstruction. When the judge denied bail citing flight risk and potential tampering with witnesses, I finally exhaled. While Klein stewed in a detention center, the fallout continued to cascade through Brannix. Internal audits revealed other irregularities: smaller, more hidden shell accounts, manipulated payroll entries, falsified contracts. The depth of the rot stunned even the most cynical analysts. The company's board released a statement calling Klein's actions deeply disappointing and announced a complete restructuring of leadership. But to me, it was too late. They hadn't been blind, they had been complicit. Either through fear or greed, they'd let a criminal empire grow under the guise of executive vision. In the midst of the legal storm, I was approached by the Department of Justice. They wanted me to prepare for trial as their primary witness. That meant depositions, witness prep sessions, mock cross-examinations, the full package. It was exhausting, emotionally brutal, and relentless. Their goal wasn't just to convict Klein. They wanted to make an example of him. Healthcare fraud at this scale, combined with retaliation against a whistleblower, was a case the DOJ intended to win publicly. The trial was scheduled for early spring, giving both sides just under 5 months to build their cases. During that time, I returned to my apartment for the first time since leaving town. It felt like a crime scene, not because anything had happened there, but because of everything that had. I sat on the couch where I'd read my termination email and remembered the hollow disbelief. The anger, the sense of being alone. But I wasn't alone anymore. The agents, the prosecutors, even the journalists, people believed me now. And not because I yelled loudest, but because I hadn't backed down when I had every reason to. In one of the final pre-trial meetings, Agent Crenshaw told me something I hadn't known. You weren't just the first to speak out. You were the only one who stayed standing. We've documented at least 6 other internal complaints that were quietly dismissed. Most of them came with NDA payouts. One person, Paul Ellis, was nearly fired into bankruptcy. I remembered Paul. He had been so careful, so nervous even when sending his document. They made examples of people to teach everyone else to shut up, Crenshaw continued. That's why this trial matters. It's not just about fraud. It's about silencing truth. When the trial began, I was called on the second day. Walking into that courtroom, taking the witness stand, and swearing to tell the truth. It felt more sacred than I expected. The prosecutor asked me to explain how I first discovered the suspicious payments. I walked them through it step by step. The spreadsheet, the vendor name, the lack of deliverables, the pushback from Laura, the sudden HR intervention. Every word I spoke was tethered to documentation they projected on a large screen for the jury to see. I pointed out signatures, highlighted approval chains, explained how executive overrides bypass normal checks. When they showed the jury the emails between Klein and Julia St. James, I felt a shift in the room. Jaws tightened, eyes narrowed. The audacity of the messages, mocking compliance, laughing about pulling another fast one, sickened even the most stoic jurors. The cross-examination came next. Klein's lead defense attorney tried to paint me as emotionally unstable, a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. She brought up my termination, my emotional distress after the firing, even my temporary relocation. Miss Miller, would you say you were under extreme mental stress when you began compiling these documents? Of course I was, I replied. I'd just discovered my company was bleeding millions into fake vendors and no one wanted to listen. Stress didn't cloud my judgment, it sharpened it. There was a murmur in the room. The judge banged his gavel. The attorney backed off. Then she shifted tactics. Did you ever attempt to extort the company for a settlement in exchange for your silence? My attorney objected. The judge sustained. But the question hung there, ugly and insinuating. I stared directly at the jury and said clearly, I never asked for money. I asked for accountability. That was the moment I knew I'd won them. Not legally. They'd still deliberate, but emotionally. They understood now. This wasn't about bitterness. It was about right and wrong. Other witnesses followed. Paul testified remotely. A former junior accountant described how compliance reports were deleted before audits. A cybersecurity contractor showed metadata logs proving internal documents were backdated. One after another, they painted a picture not just of one man's greed, but of a system built to protect it. And through it all, Klein sat motionless, lips tight, as his empire was dismantled in front of him. In closing arguments, the prosecution laid it out clean. Stephen Klein used a network of deception to embezzle millions from a company trusted with people's health. And when someone noticed, he didn't stop. He retaliated. He tried to erase her. But the truth didn't disappear. It stood up. I felt the entire courtroom watching me, and I didn't look away. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I tried not to obsess, but I couldn't help it. Every hour ticked like thunder. When the call finally came, I rushed to the courthouse. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Stephen Klein was remanded to federal custody immediately. Julia's trial would follow, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. I sat outside the courtroom afterward, the afternoon sun cutting through the glass like a quiet reward. My lawyer sat beside me but said nothing. She didn't need to. It was done. The man who had stolen money, silenced voices, and nearly destroyed my life would spend the next 25 years behind bars. And the best part? I didn't have to destroy him. I just had to tell the truth, loud enough, long enough, until someone finally listened. In the weeks following the verdict, my life didn't snap back into place the way I once hoped it might. There was no magical reset button, no parade of job offers or instant restoration of reputation. What I got instead was a quiet kind of clarity. The storm had passed, but I wasn't the same person who first uncovered that invoice. I had stood in court and told the truth, knowing full well that people like Stephen Klein rarely faced consequences, and yet this time, one of them did. It didn't erase what happened, but it meant something. It meant that the system, flawed as it is, still had pressure points. And I had found one. Brannick's health systems didn't collapse, but it came close. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, they announced sweeping internal reforms, a full turnover of the board, and the appointment of an interim CEO with a background in corporate ethics. Investors panicked initially, but the PR team worked overtime to salvage what they could. Their stock continued to tumble, shareholder lawsuits piled up, government regulators issued sanctions, fines, and mandatory compliance audits. Behind every headline, there were teams of people working frantically to clean the wreckage Klein left behind, and while they scrubbed and rewrote history, I stayed exactly where I was, watching. The media attention was relentless for a while. I was contacted by every major news outlet, podcast, talk show, and online publication looking for a quote, a soundbite, a story. Some painted me as a hero, others tried to dissect my motives, to spin it into a story of revenge or instability. But I didn't owe them a narrative. I gave a few interviews, carefully chosen, where I emphasized one truth. I hadn't wanted any of this. I had only wanted someone to care, someone to do the right thing, and when no one did, I made sure they no longer had the choice to ignore it. What surprised me most were the messages from strangers, Hundreds of them. Some were other whistleblowers, people who had tried and failed to speak up in their own companies, some of whom had been forced into silence with settlements or threats. Others were ordinary people just thanking me for not giving up. One message came from a woman in Colorado who worked in hospital administration. She wrote, "You gave me the courage to report something I've been sitting on for 6 months. I hope it doesn't destroy me, but if it does, at least I won't be the only one." I stared at her message for a long time before replying. It might cost you, but it's always worth more than silence. Around that time, I was approached by a nonprofit legal group that specialized in protecting whistleblowers. They offered me a position as a consultant, helping train others on how to gather evidence, understand their rights, and navigate the minefield of corporate retaliation. It wasn't what I'd imagined for myself. I'd always thought I'd rise through the ranks of a Fortune 500, not become a face for resistance. But the work felt honest, useful, necessary, so I said yes. The first time I stood in front of a small group of terrified employees, people from banking, education, even tech, I realized how broken the system really was. These weren't rebels or troublemakers. They were people who wanted to do their jobs without having to compromise their integrity. They didn't want to burn it all down. They just wanted a workplace that didn't punish honesty. I showed them how to collect documents without breaking the law, how to create a digital trail, how to protect themselves legally before stepping forward, and I told them something no corporate ethics poster ever would, that the truth will cost you something, but hiding it will cost you more. One afternoon, after a training session in DC, I got a call from Agent Denton. His voice was more relaxed than I'd ever heard it. "I thought you'd want to know. Julia St. James just took a plea deal. She gave us the names of 2 more executives who helped set up the shell companies." I sat in silence for a moment, letting it sink in. "She's looking at 10 years, maybe more," he added. "We're expecting a new round of indictments by next month." I thanked him. After we hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Despite everything, Brannock's tried to reach out. Their new legal counsel sent a carefully worded letter offering a settlement, framed as a gesture of mutual closure. It came with a hefty sum and a non-disclosure clause. I read the document twice before tossing it into the shredder. They still didn't get it. I didn't want their money. I didn't want to be silenced again. I took a different kind of offer instead. A university in Chicago asked if I would guest lecture in their graduate business ethics program. I agreed, thinking it would be a one-off. But after that first class, after watching a room full of future executives sit in stunned silence as I walked them through the anatomy of a $5 million, 0-cents fraud, I realized I had found something I didn't even know I was looking for: a platform, a purpose. I wasn't just teaching them how to spot red flags. I was teaching them what happens when everyone looks away. I told them how I had trusted the chain of command, followed the rules, and still ended up unemployed, blacklisted, and alone. And how, despite all of that, I still wouldn't change what I did. Because someone had to be first. Months passed, the headlines faded. Klein's sentencing date was set for the fall. I would be there, not for vengeance, not even for closure, but to stand in that courtroom one more time and remind him and everyone else watching that the truth doesn't vanish just because it's inconvenient, that silence can be broken, that even when the system tries to crush you, you can still choose to speak. And sometimes that's enough to bring the whole damn tower down. The morning of Stephen Klein's sentencing, the courthouse was quieter than I expected. There were no crowds, no reporters shouting questions, no spectacle. Just a crisp autumn chill in the air and the sound of my boots clicking against the marble floor as I walked the same hallways where this story had once begun. It had been nearly a year since I'd received that email, the one that pulled the rug out from under everything I thought I understood about loyalty, justice, and the corporate world. And now it was ending in the same building where I had first told a room of strangers the truth. I wasn't here for revenge. I was here to witness the final act of a system catching up with a man who had spent years thinking he was untouchable. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy. Stephen sat at the defense table in a dark gray suit that didn't quite fit him anymore. He looked smaller somehow, like someone who had finally realized the weight of consequences. Julia St. James wasn't present. Her own hearing was scheduled separately, but the tension between the attorneys, the prosecutors, and the few Brannock's representatives sitting in the gallery was enough to fill every inch of that room. I was asked if I wanted to give a victim impact statement. I hadn't decided until the night before, but as I sat there, watching the judge prepare to deliver Klein's sentence, I realized there was still something I needed to say. When the judge called my name, I stood slowly, walked to the front, and faced the bench. My voice was steady, not because I wasn't nervous, but because I had already said everything that mattered months ago. This was just the last breath of the storm. Your Honor, I began, this case has never been about one invoice, one company, or one man's greed. It's about the people who get hurt when honesty becomes a liability. It's about what happens when silence is rewarded and truth is punished. I turned just slightly to glance at Klein. He didn't meet my eyes. I lost my job, my reputation, and my peace of mind, because I told the truth, and I would do it all again. The judge nodded, thanked me, and then turned to Stephen. What followed wasn't dramatic. It was methodical, procedural, the measured voice of a man who had read every document, heard every testimony, and reached an unshakable conclusion. 24 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole until at least 18, a personal fine of $2,700,000, 0 cents, restitution orders, mandatory forfeiture of assets acquired through the fraud. Stephen didn't flinch, but his attorney's shoulders slumped. And just like that, it was done. No applause, no cheers, just the gavel's sharp crack echoing through the chamber, sealing a chapter that had taken a year of my life to write. Outside the courthouse, the sky had clouded over. I stood for a moment on the steps, breathing in the cold air, letting it cut through the weight of everything that had come before. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel broken. I felt whole, like someone who had walked through fire and somehow, piece by piece, forged herself into something stronger. I had no illusions that the world would suddenly be better. There would always be more clients, more companies that chose profit over principle. But now, there would also be people who remembered that one woman stood up and said enough. Back home, I framed the original termination email, not out of spite, but as a reminder. It hangs above my desk now, next to the certificate from the Whistleblower Protection Foundation and a photo from the first workshop I taught. It reminds me that truth is rarely convenient, often costly, and always worth it. People still contact me. Some ask for advice. Others just want to be heard. I listen. I help when I can. And I tell them the same thing I had to learn the hard way. You don't need to be loud, powerful, or connected to make a difference. You just need to refuse to stay quiet when it matters most. I never got my old life back, but I found something better, something real, a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to titles or paychecks or corporate performance reviews. I became someone I never expected to be, someone who stood up and didn't sit back down. And now, when I look in the mirror, I see a woman who was fired for telling the truth, and who answered that injustice not with vengeance, but with persistence. They tried to erase me. Instead, I became the footnote to their fall, and that, I've learned, is more than enough.